My name is Steve Enniss. I'm director of the Ransom Center, and I just wanted to extend a very warm welcome to all of you and wish you a productive meeting today. The Ransom Center is delighted to be a partner on the Modernist Archives Publishing Project, and we're delighted to serve as the host for these conversations yesterday and continuing today. And I hope the day will be a fruitful one for you. I thought what I would do is say just a little bit about the origins of the Ransom Center's collections. And the reason for this is really to illustrate how intertwined the Ransom Center's own identity is with the modernist holdings, some of which you all are studying so closely. But the Ransom Center itself, as many of you may know, was founded as the Humanities Research Center in 1957. And significantly, that was the year that the Russians launched the Sputnik rocket. There was tremendous investment during the Cold War, of course, in science and technology, but Harry Ransom believed that there should be a commensurate investment in the arts and humanities. And so this institution was really formed at that historical moment, but immediately began collecting contemporary or near contemporary materials. In fact, one of the things you most often hear about the Ransom Center, in addition to the strengths of its collections, is how up to the minute, up to date it is in its current collecting. I may say more about that in just a moment. But from the beginning, the Ransom Center was acquiring modernist collections. And it was just a year later, in 1958, when the first of two large acquisitions of the E Hanley Collection came to the Ransom Center. E Hanley had come from a wealthy Pennsylvania family from Bradford, Pennsylvania. And his family had made their fortune in brick making, but had also invested in more recent years heavily in oil and gas. And what Hanley did, he was devoted to fine art, but also to rare books and to manuscripts. And he built an extraordinary collection of not only rare books and art, but also the writer's own papers. And in fact, the Hanley Collection, when it came to us, contained extraordinary holdings of Shaw, of D.H. Lawrence. James Joyce's corrected page proofs for Ulysses were part of that collection. It included a lot of Samuel Beckett. And by some accounts, Hanley was collecting Beckett material related to Godot even before the play had had its English language premiere in London in 1955. So some of what associated with the Ransom Center just a moment ago are up to date, up to the moment collecting really goes back to some of the collectors and the collections that form the foundation of the center's holdings. Interestingly, Hanley had attended Harvard and overlapped with T.S. Eliot, and some suspect that the reference in The Wasteland to a Bradford millionaire may be a reference to T.E. Hanley, maybe. In any case, the Ransom Center has continued to add to its holdings of modernist authors over the years. We continue to build collections at a very active pace. But there's often a lag time in collecting of a few decades. And so as time marches forward, we continue to march forward with it. And we're perhaps most well known now for our contemporary collecting of writers who came of age in the 80s and 90s and even more recently. So you're here at an extraordinary research center with deep holdings in literary modernism, but deep holdings more broadly in 20th and 21st century literature. Part of what's so gratifying about hosting an event like this one today is that the nature of assembling any collection, while there's this force to draw things in, this desire to collect it all for completeness, while there's that inward force in play, there's also, of course, this outward dispersal of archives that occurs quite naturally. And so our collections, as you all know better than anyone, are scattered widely by our collections. I mean, those we all share commonly. They're scattered widely, and it's projects like the Modernist Archives Publishing Project that link these collections in a very meaningful way. And we're delighted to be collaborating with you in that important work. And I just wanted to extend, on behalf of my colleagues here at the center, a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for being here.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Kayleigh Voss. I'm a graduate student here at the University of Texas, as well as a graduate student employee at the Ransom Center. I am happy to be acting as the chair of this very first panel of the conference. It's called MAPP Roundtable, Relaunching the Modernist Archives Publishing Project, the Hogarth Press in 1922. And we are joined on stage by Helena Clarkson of University of Reading, Illusha Nokhrin of University of Toronto, Helen Southworth of University of Oregon, Alice Staveley, Stanford University, Elizabeth Willson Gordon from King's University, Edmonton, Kristen Willson from the University of Texas at Austin, and Nicola Willson from the University of Reading. I will leave it to them to do their presentation. At the end, we will have some time for questions and answers, so I look forward to hearing from you then.
Thank you, Kayleigh. Okay, well, thank you all very much for being here today. My name is Nicola Willson, and we're delighted you could join us. Thank you for coming. Thank you also to the HRC for hosting our second library workshop. And I'd like to extend a big thank you to Kristen Willson as well, who's one of our GRAs, who's done a huge amount of liaising with various colleagues in the centre to make today and yesterday a success. So as Steve mentioned, we've gathered in Austin for our second Library Partners workshop. We've got representatives working with us on the project from the Berg and Washington State University Pullman, as well as University of Sussex, University of Reading, and 2 Canadian research libraries, as well as the HRC. And we're also here to relaunch the Modernist Archives Publishing Project, which we've been kind of rebuilding and is now in its second phase. We're going to talk a bit more about that. When we were thinking about today and the idea of the kind of feminist infrastructures and asking different colleagues to talk about their work on women in publishing, we were kind of thinking about how MAPP is also functioning as a feminist infrastructure in some ways. And we really hope that you'll get a sense from our mini presentations this morning about how feminism is kind of cooked into the project in the way in which we're working together and building this thing through the content and the design of the project, and also in the kind of research outputs and the way we're thinking about our materials. I should say on represented, this is some of the MAPP team. We are actually a bigger project team, and we've got we've got some directors here, some PhD students, archivists, and again, we're trying to kind of model different ways of working with each other as we go forward and build. So we're going to talk for about 5 minutes each, so leave time for questions, and we're going to do a little bit on kind of what MAPP is and the kind of backstory, how we've got to where we are. We're going to look a little bit in detail at some of the content that's going in and how we're building it, and then we're also going to think about what's coming out of the project. And because it's 2022 and there's all the kind of 1922 events going on this year, we're also going to think a little bit about the Hogarth Press in 1922 as a business. So yeah, MAPP is a multi-institutional, international digital humanities project. We're working with various different library partners, and we have had different funding streams. We've been funded so far by a couple of Canadian grants and a UK grant. We're still working on the Americans. So we've called it a critical digital archive. We're working on 20th century publishing collections, publishers' archives, which are obviously kind of huge and messy and complicated. Our first case study really is the Hogarth Press archive, which is kind of diasporic, has been split across different countries. The project came out of 5 academics who kind of worked in Hogarth Press collections in different places, and the kind of desire to make materials more accessible in a digital format, and potentially also do different things with those materials digitally. So the Hogarth Press was Leonard and Virginia Woolf's publishing house, established in 1917. They published over 500 texts up to the mid-40s when they went to Chatham and Windus. It was a really diverse, anti-colonial, radical publishing house. So we're trying to model that in the way that we're thinking about the project as well. Okay, I'm going to move on because I've got 1 minute left according to my time. So this models some of the kind of the data model that we've thought about as we've put the project together. So what we're really trying to do is give a sense of book production in the round, so a 360-degree understanding of the kind of people involved in making books, the editorial production processes, right through to kind of readership and sales. And that material, at least for some of the works we're working with the Hogarth Press, is gathered in lots of different library collections. On the screen you can see, you can kind of go into the website looking at the kind of different works that the Wolfs publish, the books. This shows some of the kind of ephemeral resources that were coming from publishers' archives. We've also got a lot of correspondence in there now, which is kind of opening up different avenues of research. And as I said, we initially built the project in one type of software. We've migrated over the last year to a different display, and that was also an opportunity for us to think about the user experience. So all archives are messy and complicated, and I think we worked with a couple of user experience designers at the University of Toronto, some students on their master's program, who helped us to do a bit of user testing and see if people could access the materials in different ways. These are some of the kind of key things that came out, which we might be able to talk about a little bit in Q&A at the end. But one of the big things was images, less text for us as academics, and I think thinking about the information architecture more clearly. So there's now a way in through publishers and the businesses, because the main aim and goal of the project is the idea of putting book publishers back into our understandings of modernism. Okay, I'm going to pass on to Illusha, who's going to talk a little bit about the kind of people side of the project.
Hi everyone, my name is Illusha Nokhrin. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. I don't know if you can all hear me okay. Okay, thank you. And I'm also the biographies editor and the project manager at MAPP. So the biographies at MAPP are the largest born digital side of our content. So and if you count metadata as born digital data, then metadata is probably actually the largest, and you probably should count that. But in any case, the biographies are one of the biggest parts of MAPP as a born digital entity. We currently have 48 biographies up on the MAPP website, so we're almost at 50. Depending on how things go, the 50th is likely to be either T.S. Eliot or Blanche Knopf, so do look out for those. And for the biographies, they've been contributed to MAPP by quite a wide variety of scholars. So we have biographies that have been written by undergraduate students, graduate students, by professors, but also by independent scholars. So we have quite a wide selection of authors for the biographies, which has been really great for the site, I think, and it's great to have collaboration and input from all kinds of researchers, and both traditionally academic researchers and less traditionally academic researchers. And so one of the things that we have changed recently as part of the site relaunch or alongside it is the review policy. So in the past, what we've done with the biographies is that we've essentially reviewed them internally, sometimes soliciting a little bit of outside review or feedback for the biographies. But even though our team is fairly broad and fairly diverse, we don't really have the knowledge of all of the biography subjects that we might want to have to do an in-depth review. So one of the things that we've done is we've now asked for one internal and one external reviewer for each biography. And so we're now sending out the biographies to experts on that subject in order to get them reviewed, as well as doing our own internal reviews of them as well. And as part of that change, we also made the review process a little bit more blind. The issue of crediting versus blinding reviewers is always a little bit tricky, because reviewing, as many of you might know, it tends to be somewhat of a thankless task in academia. And so we wanted to give credit to our reviewers, and that's something that we have done quite well in the past. Yeah, so it is something that we've done in the past by just saying on the biography, as you can see on the on your left-hand side there. In the past, we've simply said the names of the reviewers as editors of the biography. But in order to provide a little bit more distance between the reviewer, especially the external reviewers, and the biography authors, what we've done moving forward is removed those edited by lines from new biographies. And instead, in order to give reviewers a bit of credit for all the work that they do, which is super valuable to MAPP, and certainly makes my job a lot easier, is to list them on a list of reviewers as part of the MAPP team. So if you go onto the team page on the new website, you'll see them there. So this has been kind of a balancing act that we've tried to find in order to still give reviewers some credit, but also to present a little bit of distance and make sure that reviewers feel like they can be forthright and honest in their views of the biographies. But yes, more biographies will be coming shortly, so do look out for those. And we've really tried to make the biographies more accessible and easier to navigate also in the site relaunch. So thanks so much. And I will pass it over to Helena Clarkson.
Yes, so I'm Helena Clarkson. I'm the project archivist for MAPP. Thank you. Based at the University of Reading. And here's the slide behind me, is just sort of a visual of MAPP's workflow. I arrived on the project after quite some time. So this was created with relevant colleagues at the University of Reading as a sort of sense-making activity. The processes can happen alongside each other depending on what our priorities are for the project at a given time. And right at the top we have the cataloguing and the digitising. And the cataloguing has been a massive collaborative effort between University of Reading and the Ransom Centre's research assistants. And they've provided over 100 they've provided cataloguing for over 100 folders now. It's been a massive help for us. And then moving down to the second part of the diagram is where we focus on the rights clearance work, which is also, all of it's quite labour intensive, but this is quite an important part because before we can upload anything into the site, we have to work on our permissions and rights clearance. And because it is a live site, had to have quite a flexible approach. So there are different approaches depending on what the archival material is. And so if we just zoom in a bit more on that particular process, you can see here that we have author on file, Hogarth press letters, organisations and individuals. And so at Reading we have relationships with author estates already, so that's what the author on file relates to. So for example, Vita Sackville West, and we know the estate holder for that. We have prior permissions, and we also have an agreement with the Penguin Random House Archive and Library, which relates to the Hogarth press letters. And the ones that are need slightly more work, slightly more detective work, we have the organisations or companies and individuals that would interact with the Hogarth press. So, for instance, like we have Harcourt and Brace, who published for the Hogarth Press in America, or we have like a business called the Garden City Press, which was one of their printers. So that would relate to the company category, and individuals could be just professors who would want to quote for their syllabus, and they'd ask to quote from Virginia Woolf essays, for instance. And obviously that would require me having to find out who the first owner of the copyright holder was, so that could even be the university, but often they actually revert their rights back to the individual. So as you can see, that will require quite a lot of detective work for someone writing in like the 1920s, like electoral registers and all sorts of things like that. And so I've just subscribed to Ancestry.com to help me with some of that detective work. And so, yeah, thank you. And so this is just here to show a visual of the work I'm doing with our transcribers. And we've recruited about 13 of them. I've put a little smiley face and a red line there just to protect the person's personal details, but that's not obviously what he looks like. So that's just how and we use something called Microsoft Teams. And obviously volunteers, they give their time for free, so we want to give something back to them. And one of the reasons why it's important for us to use Microsoft Teams is because that's the platform that we use quite a lot in the UK workplaces. So this is just to show like how we've built like there's certain channels there that they can interact with, then they can interact with me, talking to me like that as they return a transcription, saying what they've had trouble with or something they found interesting. That's just a way of engaging with them. I work with the volunteer coordinator there because the University of Reading Special Collections, we share our space with the Museum of English Rural Life, and they have a volunteer coordinator there. We use a platform called Better Impact, and there's a hyperlink there if you'll share the slides later. And just to the right of that, we just have, that's how we show or give them feedback on the folders that they've been working through. So they've almost completed 100 transcriptions now, and those progress bars just there to show me and them like how we're working through it. And the very last slide I have is just an example. And here we try to, because we know that you can use things like the OCR software to scan text, but here we're using people who not just like recognizing text, but they're reading it, so they can engage with it more critically. And so we look, and that helps us expand on our keywords. So here this letter just shows Leonard Woolf, and he's speaking about how but whenever sometimes he speaks about Virginia Woolf, he says my wife. So he says I should also like my wife, who is at the moment ill, to read it before we come to any definite decision. So one of the volunteers came to me and said they've not mentioned Virginia Woolf by name, so we use endnotes to expand on those names. And so now that when someone types in Virginia Woolf, like more letters will appear, because at the moment there is quite a gap, especially the University of Reading's archive. Leonard Woolf is quite prolific, and so Virginia looks slightly hidden, which we know of course she isn't. So I thought that was really interesting, and obviously that's just the original document. But you can see also there's a quite good benefit of obviously how much clearer the text is, like if you read the transcription. Yeah, thank you.
Kristen.
This is a new slide to me, so we're going to discover it together. So our letters on the Hogarth Press are primarily from the William A. Bradley Literary Agency collection. And this is a wonderful collection full of correspondence of the William A. Bradley Literary Agency, which is based in Paris. And they're communicating with the Hogarth Press. We have this really wonderful folder, approximately 130 letters dating between 1931 to 1944. And they're having all these conversations about what it means to engage in transatlantic publishing. So we have John Lehman here, and he's writing to Mr. Bradley. A lot of these conversations are about Ivan Bunin, who is represented by the Bradley Agency. And specifically, I think on a later slide, I have them talking about the grammar of love. But let's roll the dice here and see what's next. Okay, so we're going to come back to the William A. Bradley Literary Agency. First, I want to talk through the history of the HRC with MAPP. So our stage one with MAPP was in 2015. We primarily provided metadata on some modernist works within our collection. So not so much focusing on publisher correspondence, but focusing on the modernist works themselves. And then in 2021, we worked in that wonderful Bradley collection on that Hogarth folder with that incredible back and forth. And then right now, we've moved on to Blanche Knopf correspondence. We have thousands of boxes of the Knopf records. If you have any interest in any book, it's worth doing a search in our collections to see if Knopf ever dealt with that author, that work, because we have thousands of boxes, literally. I've walked through them. It takes forever. Okay, so in this discussion, Leonard Woolf is discussing with Bradley about royalties for the Grammar of Love. So you can actually see them coming to, a discussion about how many copies are we actually feasibly going to be able to publish? What should the rate that goes back to the author be? So you can really see how they're making plans, especially during that 30s period where it's a rough time for the publishing industry. How are we actually going to get these works out? And they're also having these incredible discussions about translations. So a lot of times there's a discussion on if the Hogarth Press is going to take over the Commonwealth rights or the English Empire rights, or if they're going to take over the English language rights, because those are two very different things. If they're going to take over the English language rights, then they need to contract with an American publisher, usually Knopf. And so then there's all sorts of discussions about, is the American translation really suitable for a Commonwealth audience? Or are we going to need to make some adjustments here, or vice versa? And additionally, there's even a letter where they're saying, we recommend you use this paper manufacturer. So they're really getting into the details here, going back and forth. At one point, Hogarth writes to the Bradley agency saying, can you send us a photograph of Ivan Bunin? We need it for the book. So you can see how they're working together to bring these books together. And then I'm going to tease a little bit. Our presentation this afternoon, me and my fellow GRAs, we're going to be talking more specifically about how this collection and the Blanche Knopf letters represent really what the MAPP project is about, bringing light to women in transatlantic modernist publishing. So a teaser for later. Gonna go? Who's next? Okay.
Hi, I'm Helen Southworth from the University of Oregon. And I'm going to talk today briefly about the Hogarth Press as a business in 1922 and just highlight some of the research that we've been doing as a group on some of the materials that you'll find at MAPP. And just to emphasize that we really are conscious of trying to write at the same time that we build the project. So we're always publishing chapters, journal articles, books. We're working on an edited project at the moment about women in 20th century publishing, and lots of our own individual projects that you'll hear about during the day. So Nicola and I actually have a chapter coming out on women who worked at the Hogarth Press in the early days between about 1917 and 1925. So in 1922, the Woolfs were still in Richmond, where they founded the press at Hogarth House. They were beginning to build in terms of production. In 1918, they published 5 works. In 1923, in 1921, 6, and then 9 in 1922, which is the year we're focusing on. And as production grew, they started taking on workers. And 2 of the earlier workers about whom Nicola and I have written, Barbara Hiles and Alex Strachey, didn't stay very long. They just, they thought it sounded like a romantic thing to do, and I don't want to undermine them, what they did, but they didn't stick to it. Alex Strachey actually became a translator for Freud, so she went on to do different things and worked with Leonard Woolf as a research assistant. But then subsequent to that, the Woolfs took on Marjorie Jode, who was somebody that they ran into at the 1917 Club, and she worked alongside Ralph Partridge at the press. And Nicola and I have argued that that's kind of a moment where the Woolfs took more of a professional turn, and there was, as time went on, they did less hand printing and took on commercial printers as the output grew. And I just wanted to mention today, again to give you some kind of illustration in terms of the kind of work we're doing, another worker who hasn't received any attention, whose name I came across variously, but it's here you see she's mentioned very quickly, where Woolf is. This is from Woolf's diary. She's saying how overloaded she is with work at the Hogarth Press, something she always struggled with, this, what I think it's Nigel Nicholson calls her double life as publisher and writer. And she says, you know, if Leonard's been talking to Green, coming up with a plan by which she may become our secretary. Margaret Minna Green never became a secretary at the Hogarth Press, but she did type Jacob's Room, which is wonderful. And we were looking at the exhibition yesterday and seeing the letters to the typists from Joyce. And again, we are very interested in these sort of shadowy figures who are very much part of the production of work at the press. And I had this wonderful experience this morning, and three of us are staying together, and I was like, oh my God. So I'll just skip over the long quote that I was going to talk about, because Woolf, there is this very long quote where Woolf gives a mini bio of Minna Green. Woolf she wanted to write a book called Lives of the Obscure, and she never did, but there are little like potted biographies everywhere, and this is one of Minna Green, and it just gives a sense of how a university educated woman made her way through the workforce. And I'm going to talk about this at the Woolf conference, hopefully next week. But this morning I received in my email a photo of her. I was so happy. Just via research that I've been doing with the help of Elizabeth Garver from here. She sent me a couple of letters, and Rich Rag from Sussex also. I've just been looking around, and this came this morning. I discovered she was a student at the University of Birmingham, and they sent me some information about her education, and from there I learned that she was a student at Bedales, which is a kind of alternative school in the southwest of England. And so I contacted them just via email, and this morning they sent me this photo, and I believe that's her in the middle, who's doing sewing. And she was one of the first 4 female students at the school, and her mother was pushed forward for girls to be admitted to the school. So we do have, just to quickly mention, we do have Margaret Green at the site as a translator, because she translated in 1929 a book from German into English. But there's no folder for her at Reading, so we need to indicate that. But soon, hopefully, we'll also have a biography for her. But we've experienced this excitement of discovering people, and the students do too. So yeah, it's just a pleasure to work on this project. Thank you.
Me?
Yes.
Oh, it's me. I'm on. Sorry, I was heading over to my colleague Elizabeth. So I just want to point out, I think she's knitting a brown stocking.
Oh, she's knitting. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a prelude.
Which is actually
it's a prelude
important.
to Lighthouse, the Lighthouse, right?
Yes.
Knitting. So literally, this was a discovery of about 60 minutes ago, maybe 2 hours of fresh. And this is what it is like working on this project and with these particular wonderful colleagues. So how do we go? This one? Yeah. So, hello, I am Alice Staveley, and I teach at Stanford University, and I am going to talk a little bit about Jacob's Room. So, we all know that 1922 was modernism's Annus Mirabilis. It was this wonderful year. Ulysses, The Wasteland. It was also an amazing year for Woolf. She published Jacob's Room, her first declaratively, obviously radically modernist novel, written for her own press and published by her own press. So we're at the 100th year anniversary of this amazing novel. And you'll see it was also a novel that featured Vanessa Bell's first novelistic dust jacket for Woolf, and this wonderful impressionist cover. Leonard writes in his memoirs in the 60s that the cover was not universally approved of by booksellers. He says it did not represent a desirable female, or even Jacob, or his room. And it was what in 1923 many people would have called reproachfully post-impressionist, It's almost universally condemned amongst the booksellers. And so I've been doing some research on this book for a longer work that I'm working on about Woolf's as a publisher. And I was going through her diaries, and we've always noticed the curtain feature. And there's a moment where she talks about the run on drapery fabrics in shops. It's very hard to get in the war. And I thought how amazing that Vanessa's picked up on the kind of scarcity of the fabric, but she's opening to Woolf's moment in the Great War novel about Jacobs Flanders, whose death is inscribed in his last name, and he's proleptically gone at the start of the novel. So in our site, I want to, can actually, Doug, can you click on what we have in the site for Jacobs Room? Uh-huh. Is it working in this feature? This will be unfortunate because I have a big reveal. There we are. There we are. Okay. It's thinking. So this will give you a little taste of what we're hoping to achieve with absolutely every book that we have on the site. So we have information, bibliographic information at the book. We have rights permissions. We have a placeholder. In fact, we'll need to transfer that cover over into this section. If you scroll down a little bit, scroll down, you can see what related correspondence to the production of this book that we have in the site. Now, if you look at them very carefully, it's quite sparse. And this has got to do with this issue of gaps and elisions and known gaps and then undiscovered non-gaps, right, that we will be finding in other archives. So I just want to gesture quickly to, these are letters that have to do with Jacobs Room moving in the late 20s into Woolf's uniform edition. So they did a collated sort of a in-house uniform edition of her novels. So, but what we newly can do in 1922 is put the full text first edition, British first edition, online because it has come out of copyright in both the UK and Helena will put me in handcuffs and take me away if I'm saying the wrong thing. But we pretty much figured this out. So just last week, I was able to put online the full text. Now what I'll need you to do is go back. What's that? First edition, it's up there. Mm-hmm. So click on it, it's going to take a few seconds. I think scroll down and then it's on the bottom. There, so if you click on that, give it a little, view full text right down. No, keep going down. There. Yeah. It's going to take a few, I didn't realize how big it was, or how long it'll take to load. But what's important about this for scholars working on this book is manifold. It's to understand, that Woolf herself was highly invested from a very early stage in the material formatting and organization of her aesthetic argument, such that the visualization of the text on the page had interpretable meaning. And this is one of those areas where I think excavating Woolf's involvement, even when we have silences, which is not to interpret a silence as an absence, and to start trying to find a sort of theoretical language for material making in Woolf's engagement with the press. She'd love this, it's completely dark. But the point about Jacobs Room was it didn't just have a wonderful cover, it had a lot of formally organized breaks, fragments, and fractures and white space in the language of typography and design. So if you could see this, I could then speak and jump into a different way of reading Jacobs Room through computational text analysis. So one thing that I'm doing with colleagues at Stanford is to measure the white spaces in the 300-page novel so that we can get a kind of map of whether there is an organization of when a 4-line expected break becomes a 2-line, becomes a 1-line, becomes a 9-line. And so, well, in that case, I will just have to send you out to click on the link and you'll see this extraordinary novel with the foxing on the pages and the page numbers having to be arranged in a very particular way so they don't interrupt the opening of the chapters. So with that, it's over to Elizabeth.
Thank you. Okay. Can I go forward? Can you give us the slides, please? We'll skip my links.
Okay, skip your links.
Yes, it's fine. Well, I'll just show the sort of overview. I want to talk a little bit about how book distribution was working at this time at the Hogarth Press, and another sort of sense of the kinds of data we're collecting, things we might do with it, and we're making all of our files and numbers freely available to other scholars so they can use them in their own productions. So book distribution, or how authors and books find each other at this moment in time, is a really fascinating thing. Something the Hogarth Press was interested in early on was giving a platform to new voices. They published a lot of authors' first books or second books, authors who are having a hard time finding publishers elsewhere. And in 1922, they published two little-known, very fascinating female poets, Fredegonde Shove, and Ruth Manning Sanders. In both cases, they published one slim volume elsewhere, and then the Hogarth Press really encouraged them. They published lovely, in many cases, hand printed, beautiful boards, volumes of poetry that then launched their careers. And actually, Ruth Manning Sanders went on to publish 90 books. And Fredegonde Shove was quite a prolific children's author, and they both credit the Hogarth Press as a sort of inaugural and encouraging sort of moment. And so one of the things we're also trying to trace is the sort of genre outputs, but also like who is the first author, so that you could go through and filter and look at all of the sort of first time publication. So in 22, they're also publishing some Russian translations, and they're publishing the first English translations of Freud, and Jacob's Room. So it is a fairly remarkable year. We also have, let's not click on the link, but on the website, you can go through to related materials, and we have order books. So the data of sales records, in some cases, I mean, to the detail of the name of the person, how many copies they bought, when they paid, where it was sent. So you can imagine how this could be mapped and visualized in all sorts of ways. But we've also spearheaded through Alice and a collection of brilliant students at Stanford. They have taken, starting with Woolf, her sales data from 1924 to 1944, and collated all of this information, 25,000 lines of data, cleaned it, organized it, and then they have been able to create some really fascinating insights and visuals. So this is just one example of Woolf in the bookshops. You can see how it is. These are large purchasers, and then you can trace W.H. Smith is the biggest buyer of Woolf's books over time.
She went through wholesalers.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, and even from very early days. So this is another sort of interesting. So in 1922, the Hogarth Press was still selling books by subscription, but they were also selling to bookstores, but only sort of select ones. And fascinatingly, one major subscriber was also a bookseller. So they're interested in sort of multiplicity of practices, even from very early on. And so A subscribers paid a deposit and received every publication of the press. B subscribers were just given notice of these things. So they had a kind of patronage model to help fund things, but then it was also in bookstores. And the quote on the previous slide from George Bernard Shaw in 1920 says, how does one get a Hogarth Press book? So they also had a kind of network that they were always looking to expand, but I also argue in some places that the exclusivity was part of the appeal, that you wanted to sort of become an insider in this. And we're going to be down the road a bit sharing the list of the subscribers. We have at the University of Sussex a list of who all these people were, some of the sort of expected names of the Bloomsbury Circle, but also some sort of surprising names of people. And as we saw in the exhibition for the Joyce papers, there's subscribers for Ulysses. It would be very fascinating to compare those two lists and see how these networks interacted or didn't. And so thinking about where these books ended up, there's all kinds of mapping possibility. Oh, that's a terrible pun. But actual sort of, yeah, maps of where the books are moving and how this changes over time, how the network becomes global. The colonial cloth editions of books are also noted in the sales ledgers when they're heading out to Canada, Australia, and elsewhere. And then we have sort of biographies of bookstores. So where are these bookstores? What are their own sort of fascinating histories? Yes, and these are the larger ones, but there's many, many other. And The Hogarth Press books were very early on available in Japan, for example, which is fascinating. How does that come to be? So you can see the sort of future horizons of possibility are really rich and multiple. So I think I'll stop there.
So we just wanted to finish up with gesturing, where we're hoping the project is going to go over the next few years. So you've heard a little bit about some of the work we've been doing from the Hogarth Press texts and the archival materials around that. These are some of the different things we're hoping to include as we kind of expand more into the idea of the kind of transatlantic publishing. So Kristen mentioned the Bradley agency, the Knopf materials that we're hoping to include. We'd love to include some of the Sylvia Beach materials that here at the HRC that we should be able to kind of make available kind of publicly within the resource. We're working with University of Sussex to incorporate Virginia Woolf's, it's called the 3 Guinness Scrapbook. So it's the scrapbook she was compiling as she was writing and thinking about writing 3 Guineas, and that will kind of bring Sussex in more firmly through their department. And we're also, because of so many of the kind of the links around kind of feminism and women in publishing and also in personnel and reprints, we're also hoping to include some of the Virago Press papers that are at Reading. So Carmen Khalil, and there's kind of a history with Nora Smallwood, who was moved from kind of the Hogarth Press to Chatham Windus to Virago, and Virago reprinted lots of Hogarth texts. So that's a really interesting connection that we can potentially follow up as well. And I think that this is kind of, thank you very much for your attention. This is the link to the site, which we can all explore in a bit more detail later. And these are some of the outputs that we've gestured towards. We've also got like a teaching and research component on the site where we give some kind of example classes and things as well, and how people might want to use the site in different ways. So yeah, thank you so much for your attention. If we've got any kind of questions and things, comments, that would be great to talk through. Okay, thank you.
If anyone has a question, please feel free to just raise your hand.
No, so I might have said that. I misspoke. I apologize. In the limited correspondence that we have here, 130 letters, when they do bring up, we have an American publisher in mind, it happens to be Knopf once or twice. So that does seem more likely. I need to review the letters. I forget honestly who brings up Knopf, but I know Knopf is part of these conversations once or twice. Yeah. Apologize for the generalization. Yeah.
It was really varied. So Harcourt Brace were Virginia Woolf's main publisher. She published 2 books with George Doran, so The Voyage Out and Night and Day, and then once she moved to Harcourt Brace, they did all the rest of her works in the US. But when it came to the Hogarth Press books, they Leonard would kind of try Harcourt Brace, he'd go to Knopf. There were kind of quite a lot of different publishers that they worked with in the US, and sometimes quite often things would be rejected, or as Kristen said, they wouldn't necessarily, the American publisher wouldn't necessarily see the American market for the text. So it's quite varied. So the Berg, who we're working with now, they've got Harcourt Brace correspondence, which is some of that replies back to Leonard that we've got in the archive. And with this project, really, as we're working with more partners, we're really hoping to a lot of that's new bibliographic work as we look for, like, so from the Reading folders you can see the outgoing, who they were submitting the text to, and then where it's rejected sometimes, and then including the different US American versions. With Washington State Pullman, who's one of the partners, they have copies of kind of all Woolf's, Virginia Woolf's first American editions, so we've included those in the site now. But you know, the Hogarth Press, it's 500 texts, it's a lot of different work which isn't in the published bibliographies, so that's something the project can do, I think, over the next few years. But yeah, Kristen's team have been focusing specifically on the Bradley Agency and Knopf. Thank you for the question. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was hoping that they'd interact with each other more on it, but that's yet to happen. That is yet to happen, and there's various levels of confidence on it. Some people still like to just email me instead of, but there are some people that do find that function useful because they can scroll back and see previous conversations that I've had. So even if they don't do it directly, they've got this sort of support from other volunteers, like sort of retroactively, I guess. But once they get onto Teams, they download it. I think they do like that function, because sometimes they just return things and they just like to leave me little comments on things they found hard or interesting, because there's a sense of them feeling like, oh, I don't think I've done this quite right. I always try to tell them that they're doing really great and there's a lot of nuances and things, but yeah. And also I should say that Sheila Fisher, who I sort of mentioned as a volunteer coordinator, I don't think I mentioned her by name, has been chairing Zoom meetings as well. So once a month, we invite them all, and if they can come, because obviously people are giving their time and they sometimes do it around their jobs and everything. We have these monthly meet-up sessions, and they really enjoy that. I know the first kick-off meeting we did, Nicola also came and gave a presentation on MAPP in general, and they like that. And one volunteer is getting really into it actually, and they bought MAPP's publication, and they've gone out and said, I've never read Virginia Woolf, I'm going to go out and start with Mrs. Dalloway, and getting really excited about it, and that's really nice. Yeah, and we also do in-person events with Mill as well, so that's another thing that we're going to do in July, where we get them together. So yeah, there's a community in that sense, but I'd say that I don't think they use Teams directly to talk to each other, because I think they like to go through me before they I tell them that a lot of it is subjective as well, because it's just me doing the proofing at the end, and someone else might have a different take on that. I am hoping that once they become more confident, someone will move into the role of a proofer, so that there will be someone else, but at the moment it's just me. But yeah, so I don't know if that answered the question, but yeah,
Perhaps just add as well, so the transcription work stream is the newest thing that we've been working on. So we've been working with students in different places for quite a few years, but it's been really great to have kind of public volunteers. So we've got people of different ages, some retired people and things, who are enjoying working on their correspondence. And I think the thing is anyone knows, if you've ever worked in an archive or kind of looked through those kind of letters, everything becomes fascinating, even something that might seem quite dry about kind of reprints or paper and things. So that's been really lovely, and yeah, we're hoping, as Helena said, to do more kind of in-person things as well when we get back. So yeah, thank you. So do you want to take it? Do you want to take it?
Start it? Well, I'll start. Do you want me to? Oh, so this. Oh, this is feminism. Right. I'm thinking of something Claire, our colleague who's in Toronto and maybe online watching. She said yesterday, it's baked into everything that we do. And I think from the moment of inception 10 years ago, where the original founders, we all knew each other from various Wolf conferences, modernist studies, and we knew we'd been in archives at different times. We're kind of, intergenerational. We were trained at different institutions in different countries often. And I think that recognition in 2012 when we sat down and we realized that it wasn't just about what we were in the archive to get for ourselves, and that it was bigger than us. And we couldn't say what we needed to say unless we collaborated. So we had to reform the model of academic work, which is a very feminist thing to do, in order to say simultaneously the monographical and individual authored sort of things we were doing. But in my experience, what I realized in those early years is that I also couldn't say what I needed to say in the book without doing this work either, because it reflected, it got me into the business of making. And I say that cautiously, right? The business in the making. And that Woolf was doing this herself. And if you read her at a very specific frequency, you can hear her working in those collaborative ways as well. So for me, it was a very it was both organic for all of us, but it was also evolutionary and confirmatory of what sort of was ineffable. And then it's become able to be said. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. It's a bit big, but
and I think we're also quite interested in the transparency of what we're trying to do, the transparency of labor, not only sort of recovering and highlighting all these amazing contributions of often, the initial that becomes a person that then we can write a biography about, but also the labor of all of our sort of wonderful team members. We've tried very hard to credit our from undergraduate student team members all the way up to postdocs and other colleagues and things, trying to be, as Illusha's presentation highlighted, trying to think sort of thoughtfully and creatively about how we can fully acknowledge not only the labor, but also sort of gaps and things that we're the sort of in progress. Our blog posts often talk about the things that we're attempting or the limits to things too, so that it's almost like a peek behind the curtain as part of the way we have decided to move this forward.
Yeah, perhaps I'll just add there's lots of really good feminist DH work now on collaboration, and also how it's we're building, but also the idea of kind of thinking about kind of feminist tools of knowledge. So one of the things that we didn't particularly talk about in the way that we've described the correspondence, we have added an extra metadata field for the typists, because actually if that's something we're going to write about and are interested in, so you can now kind of search by typists. And when the initial kind of letters were kind of given on deposit to the archive, that kind of you've got the creator perhaps, or Leonard Woolf might have signed something or dictated a letter, but you don't have that kind of layer. So that's been something that we've enjoyed doing. But yeah, I think recognition is a big thing as well. And yeah.
So recognition and the bridge with our pedagogy as well, because when we train students to work on metadata, we are also collaborating with them. And in that large financial records project 5 years ago at the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis, which was an emergent and consolidating DH center on campus, I said from the outset that you will be co-authors on anything that comes out of this project, which I think at the time I just sort of said. And then as we worked through and the pieces, it's going to come out in the world, that seemed obvious to me. But then I realized that it was somewhat unusual too. But that recognition of named recognition in the work that we do now, but also in the excavation of people who were working 100 years ago to support this business is simultaneously crucial.
And I think just our writing together, which we've
right.
done a lot since
Yeah.
we started working on the project, was relatively new for all of us. And we've co-authored a book together, and then various worked in teams of two, three, four. And that's been a wonderful experience. We've all felt really invigorated by that. And I think it's changed all of our professional lives.
It has,
yes.
yeah. And actually technology has leveraged that because, we can share writing in real time.
Demo. I didn't realize we were going to be kind of disconnected from the. But yeah, we can look through later.
It's hard for us to disconnect from it.
In terms of writing, I really like Jacqueline Verminant's pieces. She's been working on, and Lauren Klein is great as well. And there's a recent book called Data Feminism, 2010. That's, Claire mentioned that recently. But I think, Jacqueline Verminant, I think actually used that kind of feminism should be cooked or baked into a project, which I might have paraphrased earlier, that idea that it should be kind of explicit as well in what you're doing and think about things.
There's also some French colleagues, and we're going to talk to, Laurence is going to talk to us later about the Bradleys, but she's part of a team who are looking at translators and agents who brought American literature to France, and Cécile Contenay she's the lead on that. It's called Les Passeurs of American literature or something, and so I know they've used a lot of your materials here from the HRC, but that's a great project too.
Well, there's Suzanne Churchill's project on Mina Loy, which also has a very, there's a sort of maker space on their site and manifestos and quite digitally innovative, trying to echo some of her aesthetics of poetry and things too. It's a great project.
And of course there's, the Modernist Journals project, which is, a predecessor of ours. And I will say when we began this, the digital humanities community is by necessity deeply collaborative. And so we had to seek a lot of advice from people who had built, the MJP, and then more recently we've been working with the Shakespeare and Company
project, which is wonderful.
Which is wonderful, the Lending Library Cards, Sylvia Beach's shop. And so so we, and the William Blake site, we sought a lot of advice, the Rossetti, we did a lot of, we had to, because we had to train ourselves in the field.
And Wolf Online, of course.
Wolf Online,
which
gosh,
was,
yes,
Julia
yes.
Briggs' project that Mark Hussey and
Mark Hussey took over.
Everyone we should cite now.
Yeah. No, we are. Yeah.
There's so many actually really good models.
And there is in 19th century DH, there's NINES, which is an organization that oversees all of the projects, the digital projects in the 19th century. And then for the 20th century, there's ModNets. And so some of the projects are under that umbrella, and we need to.
It's a sort of peer review mechanism for digital humanities sites. So you get peer reviewed for your infrastructure and your content, and then you get welcomed in, and there's interoperability between your site and MJP. When we get into ModNets, things on our site will be able to be picked up.
That would be wonderful to have some interoperability with MJP, for example. The Voss didn't publish many journals. They did two, a very short run, one called The Search, one called Youth. But obviously we have a lot of shared authors, and if you could click through from our site to a review that appeared in one of the MJP things, I mean, there's all sorts. And with the Shakespeare Company too, I mean, we're looking at things from a slightly different angle, but it would be so wonderful to somehow have the sites linked up together.
What if, like, the Lending Library, a name from a Lending Library, and it came up in the order books, right? Because it's not just shops, it's people as well. Just sort of writing the Hogarth Press and saying, I like this book, or showing up on the doorstep will sit. Sometimes she'd open the door and there'd be someone wanting to buy a book.
Yeah.
Okay, do we have any final questions or thoughts, or? All right, in that case, I think it's about time for us to take a coffee break. And we'll be reconvening for our second panel at 11:15. Thank you, everyone.